In the heart of Yorubaland, a storm was rising. Not one that passed with the seasons, but one that raged for 16 long, unrelenting years. It was a war of resistance, a battle of principles, a struggle that shook the foundations of an empire. This was the Kiriji War, known by those who endured its fury as Ekiti Parapo. Before gunfire echoed through the hills of Ekiti, and the land trembled under the cries of war, there was Ibadan, a city not born from peace, but born through warfare. Following the fall of the Oyo Empire in the early 1800s, warriors, outcasts, and mercenaries banded together on a hill to build a new bastion, Ibadan. What began as a small military camp quickly grew into a stronghold of ambition, a city of conquest. Forged in battle and sustained by bloodshed, Ibadan rose to power. They crushed the Eje, subdued the Egba, and conquered one by one the Ijesa, Ekiti, and Igbomina towns. Ibadan became the military powerhouse of Yorubaland, commanding tens of thousands of hardened soldiers, led by commanders like Oluyole, Ogunmola, and the fierce Aare Latoosa. They had a singular goal: to rebuild the fallen Oyo Empire, but this time under Ibadan's dominion. But power without limits easily turns into oppression. Ibadan's dominance wasn't just about tributes, it became tyranny. They dispatched agents called Ajeles to enforce their rule, not with words, but with weapons. These weren't simple emissaries. They were enforcers, brutal extensions of Ibadan's will. They invaded towns with muskets and machetes, seizing farmlands, taking the best of each harvest, demanding taxes, and punishing dissent with public floggings or silent disappearances. They governed with fear. No one was safe. Not women, not daughters, not even kings, who were stripped of their dignity and made to kneel before men they once commanded. In some places, festivals were outlawed, market days taxed, names altered, even prayers required Ibadan's praise before the gods. The Ajeles were more than administrators. They were living symbols of Ibadan's supremacy, oppressors cloaked in authority. But push a people long enough, steal their voices, their dignity, their dreams. And what rises is not silence, but resistance. Because defiance is not something taught, it's inherited. It's etched into the soul. And even the gentlest spirit will fight when survival becomes the only option. In Ekiti, Ijesa, Akoko, and Igbomina lands, fear began to burn into fury. And in the quiet town of Okemesi in Ekiti, that fury erupted. During a sacred festival, news arrived. Ajeles had violated a local shrine, stolen offerings meant for the gods, and abused the women of the town, rulers by fear. News of the Ajeles' execution spread like wildfire, and across Ekiti and Ijesa, chiefs, kings, and warriors who had lived in quiet fear finally rose. In Otun's palace, warlords gathered and declared a single word: Otoge. And from that cry of defiance, the Ekiti Parapo, the great Ekiti Confederation, was formed. Bound by sacred oaths and united by shared suffering, they vowed to fight Ibadan's tyranny to the bitter end. They had no standing army, no cannons, no modern arms, but they had courage, the cover of their hills, the power of their herbalists, and an undying love for freedom. New allies joined, first Ijesa, then Igomina, Akoko, even the ancient kingdom of Ife. What began as a ripple grew into a tidal wave. In the hills of Imesi-Ile, a war camp was born. It became a makeshift city, over 40,000 strong. Warriors trained, blacksmiths forged weapons, women and children sustained life amidst war. Yet, for all their unity, one thing was missing: a leader. And then came Ogedengbe Agbogungboro, the legendary war chief of Ilesa. Initially reluctant, he eventually accepted the call, and with him came a shift in spirit. When Ogedengbe rode into Ile, the morale of the Confederation soared. Out of respect, young Fabunmi stepped aside, and Ogedemgbe, the battle-scarred veteran, was named Seriki Mayaki, commander-in-chief of the Ekiti Parapo. And so began a war like none before it. A collision of not just armies, but destinies. Cannons roared, hills shook, and from their thunder came a name, Kiriji, the sound of cannon fire echoing through history. Ogedemgbe, born Orisa Omodun, came from a torrent in modern-day Osun State. Even as a boy, he stood apart, stronger, braver, a master of Yoruba wrestling. He earned his name Agbogungboro, the one who overpowers cities, long before the war drums ever called him. With unmatched strategy and leadership, he climbed the ranks of the Ajeles warriors and became a living symbol of resistance. By 1879, the hills of Okemesi and Ibadan were battlegrounds. On opposite sides stood Ibadan in the west and Ekiti Parapo in the east. Between them, the Fedebo stream flowed red with the blood of the trenches were dug, cannons roared. The land became soaked, not just with blood, but with stories. For 16 exhausting years, the Kiriji War consumed Yorubaland. Major battles like Akiran in 1878 resulted in crushing losses for the Parapo. That clash, where hundreds drowned fleeing into the Otin River, came to be known as Jalumi, the drowning. Other towns like Ibadan, Iro, Ekiti, Okemesi, and Ipoti turned into firestorms of conflict. Streets became battlegrounds, roads were cut off. Every hill was contested, every grain of land, every supply route fought over like gold. Trench warfare, guerrilla raids, imported firearms, cannons that shook the mountains. The Kiriji War became not just the longest, but one of the most advanced indigenous wars in Yoruba history. But Ibadan's power was waning. Inside the walls of authority, cracks began to form. Latoosa's grip on power loosened. His once loyal commanders grew resentful. A small but symbolic argument with his Balogun, Osung Bikun, over a single slave became the final straw. The palace murmured with betrayal. Confidence collapsed. And so, in 1885, Aare Latoosa, once untouchable, chose death over disgrace. Alone, proud, and broken, he took his own life. His end wasn't by sword or cannon, but by the silence of lost loyalty. Ibadan's morale broke. The mighty warlord who once promised to crush Ekiti in 3 days was no more. The war dragged on, but the cost became unbearable. Soldiers faltered, supplies dwindled, towns lay in ashes, trade disappeared. Over 200,000 men had gone to war, tens of thousands never returned. Yorubaland had no victors, only survivors. And in Lagos, British merchants grew uneasy. Trade routes were dead, profits evaporated. The long war endangered their economic grip. In the end, it wasn't muskets that ended the war, but exhaustion and diplomacy. On September 23, 1886, at Ile, a treaty was signed. Ekiti was declared free. Though fighting officially stopped, the last warriors laid down their arms only in 1893, when Governor G.T. Carter ordered a final disarmament. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a moral one. Ekiti Parapo wasn't just a name, it became a memory, a symbol of resilience, of unity, of the spirit that cannot be broken. They were not the biggest, they were not the best armed, but they were the most determined, and that made all the difference. The Ekiti spirit values freedom above all, and when forced to choose, they chose death over bondage.